Okay, well, welcome everybody to this first session of the Philosophy Department Research Seminar Series, and I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker in this first such session, and this is Dr. Ahmed Abdel Meguid, who many of you will know, but for those of you who don't, Ahmed attained his BA here at AUC in 2002.
Yes.
He then pursued graduate studies in philosophy at Emory University in Atlanta. He's subsequently worked at Syracuse University and Boğaziçi University in Turkey, and he's currently an assistant professor here in the Department of Philosophy. And we're delighted that our former student has come back to teach at AUC. And Ahmed specializes in Islamic philosophy. He's currently putting the finishing touches to books on Ibn Arabī and Al-Kindī, I think. But today he'll be talking to us about sort of the other great Islamic philosophers in a paper entitled Al-Ghazālī, Averroes, and the Critique of Avicenna's Metaphysics, an Arabic pre-modern critique of Essentialism and Naturalism.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a delight to be here and to be the first one in this delightful series. So thank you all for coming. For those who are joining us with Zoom, Miss Sally will kindly share with you the handout I distributed to our attendees here, our physical attendees. So without further ado, let us start. So the title, I will take the title as our guidance, Al-Ghazālī, Averroes, and the Critique of Avicenna's Metaphysics, and that as I should actually qualify what kind of metaphysics Avicenna was doing, which is modal metaphysics. And how that modal metaphysics, which Avicenna was using to break away from the essentialist naturalism of Greek philosophy, was criticized by Ghazali and Averroes, and what is the significant critique, if any, and why is it important for philosophers? And I will try at the end of the class, the lecture of the talk, to talk about why it's also relevant for those who have general interest in Arabic and Islamic studies. But in order to do that properly, let's talk a little bit about the Greeks. And since I didn't want to have either quotes in Greek or because I'm talking about three Arabic philosophers on a very specific issue, I chose to start with Charles Kahn, and a key classicist and a very important commentator on Heraclitus. Actually, he wrote the book on Heraclitus. So as you can, so what is the problem? Let me first explain it, and then I will just use, by the way, the PowerPoint as background for quotes. So I don't want you to be so much distracted by it. I will explain it, follow my handout, and then if you wish, you can look at the quotes, and in order to make your life easier, I have underlined the important parts of the quotes. So for from the very beginning of Greek philosophy, I would say, was Parmenides. Being was associated with truth, and the understanding of being was equivalent to the production of a true discourse, a veridical discourse, and that understanding of being as truth was also associated with universals, with concepts. In the mind of Plato, as I'm gonna show in the coming slide, truth was expressed as a relationship between universals, and in the form of X is one, even when we say, for instance, beauty is X, justice is X, and so on. Aristotle, of course, came on the picture, and he complicated matters more than this. Okay, he told us that there are different forms, different kinds of universals, But of course, the most important were the primary substances, okay, were the individuals themselves. But the individuals were defined either in terms of another universal, which is the essence, the concept. Okay, so Socrates is a human. Okay, or other accidental universals. Okay, other concepts. That in and of itself, the difference between Plato and Aristotle very quickly was in how do you arrive at the definitions of those universals. Plato famously said dialectic, you start with common statements and you refine them. Aristotle said, no, 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 we want accurate deductive definitions, and then we are going to draw from them in syllogistic relations, okay, definitions of new concepts so that we can understand the truth about being and about the causal relationships between beings. So one major problem was that view is that there was no sensitivity on part of Greek philosophy, and particularly the understanding when it comes to physics and the difference between physics as an empirical science where you go and do research and understand the world, and the logical foundation of this physics, okay? That is the fundamental concepts governing our inquiry into the nature of the world and understanding the world of space and time, and purely abstract logical concepts that doesn't have any manifestation in the world of space and time. Hence, we had the problem that plagued the medieval period, which is what, to quote a very interesting, relatively new book, 2016, that came out about Kant's modal metaphysics, actually, that by next time, he talks about the logisticism, okay, of the medieval period. That is, everything was defined from a logical abstract perspective and assumed that once you understand that logically defined essence, okay, you will be able to understand the truth about everything. You will have intellectual intuition. You have the knowledge of essences. And hence, what you probably all know about the opposition of empirical sciences in the medieval period and so on and so forth, and the association due to the association of the Aristotelian philosophy and theology. Okay, so what was happening in the Arab world? So here, I mean, I have a quote here: "Being for Plato is characterized as the reality which is sought after in intellectual inquiry." And the same holds for Plato. The difference, as I said, as Charles Kahn also points out, is in the complexity of the system of predication that Aristotle presented versus simple definitions of universals that we have in the Platonic theory of forms. Okay, and then Kant brings us to a very interesting claim here, okay, at the end, and that is a quote from a very interesting book of his that he published in the it was a collection of essays that came out in the 1990s, but he wrote that one in the 1970s, and I was stunned that not, if at all, anyone in the field of Islamic philosophy has paid attention to that. And he says that my general view is that the existence that we have in modern science didn't really develop in the Greeks, okay? Was not developed by the Greeks and was not developed by the early church fathers, or what we call ancient Christianity. So figures like Augustine, for instance, and so on. So who was it developed by? This is Kant's view. It's Islamic philosophy, and we are going to examine that together in a few minutes. Okay, that is just the background. What does he mean by the modern concept of existence? He quotes here two figures. I think he should have put in the Kant, but he chooses Descartes and Russell. Okay, which is the idea of the questioning of existence from an epistemic perspective. It is not that being is out there like this chair in front of me, and the concept is living in it. Okay, the logical assumption of Aristotle and Plato. Okay, that any actualization of any any actualization of any substance, okay, let's stick to the Aristotelian framework, has the concept living in any being in front of it, or manifest. Okay? It's actualized to that. No, it's rather that, and that was the question of Descartes, okay, that first I have to find an epistemic and logical ground for knowledge, and then I can start investigating different forms of existence. And that, in and of its, and of course later Russell, of course, when he talks in his classical groundbreaking work on denotation, when he talks about the difference between meaning and denotation, okay? And when he talks about his famous example, the present king of France, so it has a meaning, but it doesn't have a denotation. If that was not possible, I mean, from the Parmenidean perspective of Greek philosophy, okay? So was there really something happening in Arabic philosophy or Islamic philosophy, as Charles Kahn indicates here, and what does this, and how did that develop, and what are its implications for the view of metaphysics as a science in general, and the relationship between the metaphysics and logic on one side, and empirical inquiry in physics on the other side. Let's move to the next slide and start with Avicenna. So Avicenna, building on many thinkers before him, I would, one of them, among the most interesting are the Mu'tazilis and the early Ash'arites, who had abiding interest in modality. He developed that incredible turn in the history of metaphysics that he is rightly credited for, which is to understand metaphysics from a modal perspective, which, for those of you who are interested, I mean, there is a lot of domain, as I'm going to indicate towards the end of my talk, to connect it with many interesting things happening in the study of modality and its constitutive role in conceptualizing metaphysics, whether in contemporary analytical philosophy by people like Kripke and Lewis, or in early modern philosophy, of course, most notably by Kant, who I would put his view of modality, as I will try to show very briefly at the end in conversation, more with Averroes and Ghazali's critique of Avicenna, versus Avicenna himself, whom I think the closest one to in the modern period is Leibniz. Okay, and he was a very good reader of Avicenna. Okay, so what does he say here? I put it in Arabic, and I put that part of the statement. I made it bold and underlined because it's very telling. He says the things that enter existence, concepts that we can manifest it, that can have existence. Existence can be added to it. Okay, so we can be divided according to what? Okay, according to the infinite. That is, as a condition of the mind. It doesn't have to do with the reality, okay, with the actuality of these concepts and readings. It doesn't have to do with what we see in the world of space and time, what is actualized, the object or being as actualized. Okay, into two categories. What are these two categories? You guessed them right. It is the possible, that which doesn't necessarily have to exist, okay, which is what we call the general definition of possibility, versus the more restricted definition, what they call restricted possibilia, which is that something may or may not exist. Okay, and the necessary, which cannot not exist, or it's impossible that it would exist, impossible that it wouldn't exist. Okay, but despite the fact that Ibn Sina was making, or Avicenna was making, that modal logical foundation of metaphysics as that modality, sorry, or that conceptual modality, to be more accurate, it's a modality de re. You know, there are two kinds of modality de re and modality de dictum. The modality de dictum is a modality of the statement. The modality de re is a modality of the concepts, as a foundation for the study of metaphysics, he didn't stick to his point. Okay, why? What did he not stick to? The idea that those, and this is why I put mind and intellect, I wanted to stress that part, that these are conditions of knowledge, are logical. So later, in the same chapter, and later towards the end of the metaphysics of the Book of Healing, for instance, he says, the possible in itself must become necessary through a cause and with respect. Whatever is possible in its existence doesn't exist unless rendered necessary with respect to its cause. In other words, because this chair, let's say I am the carpenter making that chair, I could have made it purple and blue, but since it's tan and brown, okay, this means that, and it took that actual existence, and those properties, okay, this means that something necessitated, because the concept of a chair could have existed in hundreds, millions of ways, okay? This means that it has been necessitated by a specific cause, and that there are a chain of causes, because Ibn Sina was still functioning within the emanationist framework of Plotinus, okay? It goes back to the first cause, the prima causa. Okay? So while he was trying to make the break, and there are fascinating aspects that shows the empirical interest of Avicenna and how he used that modal system or modal distinction as a foundation for breaking away from essentialist understandings of medicine, for instance, in the introduction to the canon of medicine and so on and so forth. And there are many people who talked about, if you are interested in interesting secondary literature, like Al-Ghazālī, for instance, who talked about how this modality is a logical and epistemic critique of metaphysics. He is not interested in the way the truth and being are one with each other or opposite sides of each other. Is rather interested in the truth conditions of knowing, okay, based on that model. So then, after he made that move, but as I would like to argue, didn't succeed in fulfilling or staying committed to that, because once you say it is necessitated by the action, okay, or the efficient causality of the necessary existence, okay, the actions of the necessary existence, you are back with good old Aristotle and good old Plotinus. Okay, even though you made that break, but once you say everything is necessitated, then everything is causally connected, and since the prima causa is pure actuality, is God, if you want to call it, or the first cause, pure actuality is understood purely on a logical, metaphysical, abstract basis. There is no way, okay, that you can break ultimately on a metaphysical level from the framework of Aristotle, because you will have to go back to how that first cause, the prima causa, necessitates everything in the world, and you will have that logical food chain, allow me for my stupidity, that starts with, okay, from the first source, okay, which is the first cause, okay, or the unmoved mover, down to, or the one, I should say, the one, okay, in the language of Avicenna, down to us. Okay, so Ghazali and Averroes come on the picture, and they say, no, there are a lot of buts here. Okay, wait a second. You did a very nice move, but there are something wrong. There are many things that are wrong. So Al-Ghazālī has four refutations of the theory of the pre-eternity of the world. There is pre-eternity, which means that the world extends, for those of you who are not familiar with these terms, extends infinitely backwards, and there is discussions in medieval philosophy of post-eternity, which means that the world extends infinitely in the future. Okay? So the third and fourth refutations are about modality. And it is said that in scholarship, they haven't been addressed in full way, in a full and comprehensive way, except very recently. There is an excellent article about it by a very good scholar and a friend of mine, Canelli Coconelli, and And but it needs a lot, because the richness there in the third and fourth reputations are amazing. Now, let us start with the actually I skipped a slide. I apologize about that. This is the one I was looking. I was wondering because there was supposed to be Arabic there. Okay, so for those of you who can read Arabic, you can look at it, but it says the existence of the world. He's assuming, Al-Ghazālī is using the disputative, this method of, so the existence of the world, this is the position of the philosopher. If is possible before its existence, since it is impossible, and then become, it is impossible for it to then become possible. Its existence is eternally not impossible. Otherwise, if the impossibility of its existence is eternal, our saying that its existence is eternally possible is false. And if our statement, this is the philosopher, that its existence is eternally possible is false, then our statement that possibility never ceases is false. And if our statement that the possibility never ceases is false, then our statement that the possibility has a beginning becomes true. And if it is true that it has a beginning, this leads to affirming a time in which the world was impossible and over which God had no power. So hence, philosophers say, no, sorry, you cannot say that the world was eternally possible. Why? Because if you assume that, okay, that would lead to a series of contradiction, reductio ad absurdum, that would lead to the position that God at one point, okay, didn't have power over the world. Because if the possibility is existing eternally, why didn't that eternally omnipotent, omniscient being create the world? What was he waiting for? Was anything keeping him from the decision, or was he waiting for the opportune moment? Of course not. Okay. So let's look closely at Al-Ghazālī's objection, because it's fascinating. It says the objection to say if the world is such that it is eternally possible for it to be temporally originated, okay? But if it is supposed to exist eternally, then it would not be temporally originated. The factual, underline the word factual, then wouldn't be in conformity with possibility, but contrary. What is he doing? He is distinguishing radically, okay, between our conceptualization of possibility, of the essence of possible things, and the totality of those of possibilities or possibility of the world as a totality of possibility, and the actuality of these possibilities. Okay? And he's saying, no, if you do that distinction, you will immediately realize that if you say that the world is possible, okay, then it makes far more sense, okay, then that it would be created at one point, okay, rather than it had eternally existed. That is to distinguish the actuality, okay, of the world, that is that the world came into actual existence, okay, from that possibility. This is what he's trying to do. And through that, okay, he's trying to distinguish between, as I say on top of the page here, of the slide here, between truth and actuality. Between the truth, which is defined in his mind, following Avicenna, by the modality of the concept of the world. Okay? And the actuality. Now let's look at the fourth proof, which will make things clear. Yes. Okay. I didn't put Arabic here because it was too long. So they say every temporal being needs matter, since no temporal existence dispenses with matter. Why? Because of the because if it was pure actuality and not in potentiality, then what? Then it wouldn't have. Sorry, if it dispenses with matter, then it would be pure actuality in the mind of the Greeks or Aristotle in particular, and hence it wouldn't be originated. Matter then is not temporally created. The proof for this is the position of the philosopher, so that nobody gets confused, is that for this is that prior to existence, every temporal being is either possible in existence, impossible in existence, or necessary in existence. It cannot be impossible That one is obvious, because if that which is in itself is impossible, never exists at all, it is impossible for it to be a necessary existent in itself. For that which is necessary in itself never ceases to exist at all. This proves that it's possible in existence, but the possibility of the existence is a relative characterization that is not self-subsistent. It must hence need a receptacle, matter to which to relate to. So if the world is possible, all of these its refer to the world, which are the totality of possibility, the totality of the actualizations of those possible concepts, like the concept of a chair or the concept of me as an individual human. Okay, he says the objection is to say, and please focus with me on the coming line, possibility which they have not, which they have mentioned, refer to what? A judgment of the mind. He's being true to Avicenna more than the Abyssinians. He's actually responding throughout the book to Avicennians, to the followers of Avicenna. Okay? Anything whose existence the mind supposes, nothing preventing its supposing, it we call possible. And if I'm unable to suppose its non-existence, we name it necessary. For these are rational propositions. Again, these modal propositions are rational propositions that do not require an existence to which to relate. Then impossibility would require something existing, of which one would say that, because if that is, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. It doesn't require an existence so as to be rendered a description thereof, as proved by three things. I'll mention just two very quickly. If possibility requires something to which to relate, because it's a relative concept, then impossibility would require something to exist, and that, of course, is absurd. Okay, that is, if I need to assume the actuality, a being, in order to understand a particular fundamental of the logical truths with which I construct knowledge, then this in and of itself would imply that I would need that in the case of the impossible, and that would be absurd. The second is that the mind judges blackness and whiteness to be possible before their existence. If possibility is related to the bodies, then whiteness, that is the matter, then whiteness in itself is not possible and doesn't have the description of possibility. Okay? So again, there is an interest in understanding the fundamentals of metaphysics, the fundamentals of the study of concept through which we produce knowledge, and we understand the relationship in terms of logical relations, in distinction from being. Now let's go to Averroes, whose language, this is why I didn't need to put too much Arabic there, but the English is mine. The English in the first case was Michel Marmura. Okay, the grand commentary on the metaphysics is sitting, waiting to be translated. It was translated in Hebrew in the medieval period, but it's a huge undertaking. It's 4 volumes, so if anyone is interested. But Averroes' language is fantastic, and it's far more consistent. He's a far better seasoned philosopher when it comes to his capacity to use Arabic language to express philosophical concepts. Okay, so I'll start with 2 things related to that, and it relates to the quote with which I started in Avicenna, building on Al-Ghazālī. Just as a side note, before I continue there, Averroes was very much influenced by Ghazali. There is a common misconception that goes back to Ernest Renan in the late 19th and early 20th century, and other Arabic thinkers who characterized Averroes and Ghazali as fighting with each other. This agreement doesn't mean fighting. Okay? I mean, Averroes built on Al-Ghazali heavily, and he took him very seriously. His major problem with Al-Ghazali was his failure to understand demonstration and as a foundation for metaphysics, and particularly modern metaphysics in a systematic way. And that was due to to a number of reasons. One of them is the dialectical method of Al-Ghazali, which he inherited from Islamic theology, and so on. And Averroes wanted a systematic demonstrative understanding. There is very interesting work on this done, again, not very much acknowledged in scholarship, by thinkers like Jamal ad-Din al-Alawi of Morocco, who's worked in France most of his life and died in the mid-80s. He has an excellent essay on the different stages of the development of Ibn Rushd and the way his reading of Al-Ghazālī shaped those intellectual developments in his career, one stage after the other. Anyways, so he says, and I read if you can look at the Arabic, لَيْسَ صَحِيحًا أَنْ يُقَالَ. So he's responding to the last statement of Avicenna that I put in there, that every possible is necessitated, is necessary in with respect to the efficient causality of the necessary existence. So he says ليس صحيحا أن يقال أن شيئا ممكن في ذاته ولكن أزلي. So it's incorrect to say that something is possible in itself, but pre-eternal and necessary through another, as Avicenna argues. That the necessary can be either in itself or through another. Can be either in itself or another. This is impossible because the same thing cannot be as a substance both contingent / possible and then becomes necessary through other, unless it ceases to be itself. However, motion can be necessitated through a different agent, but possible in itself. The reason is that all motion comes to existence through the mover, unless it is the motion of the unmoved. So what is he getting at? What he's getting at is that the assumption of Avicenna about the necessitation, okay, of the possible by the efficient causality of the necessary existence was due to a confusion on part of Avicenna, as we're going to see in the coming slide, between which he, according to Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Rushd knew Alexander of Aphrodisias inside out, of course, because he was always using the commentary of Alexander and working on it. So the way the grand commentary is structured is that Aristotle says, Alexander says, I say, and it goes paragraph by paragraph. And he says that is due to a confusion on part of Alexander. What was the confusion on part of Alexander? Going to the last slide, it is the idea, I'll explain it first and then you can look at the text. The idea that, which is a position in Aristotelian logic, which was accepted and to a great extent is still accepted, that the fundamentals or the principles of any science cannot be proven in that science. In other words, and that comes at the very beginning of the posterior analytics, Aristotle tells, and he's right about that, that any science investigates the essential accidents, okay, of its principles, okay, but not their actual definition. Let me give an example, which is a very famous one, like the body and medicine. Medicine, okay, looks at the diseases, the physiological the physiological aspects and all of the accidents related to the body, but itself cannot define. It assumes. Okay, so based on that, Alexander said, and Avicenna followed his footsteps. I'm going to mention that and then go back to the previous slide. Okay, that metaphysics, okay, because it is that which it is a science which understands universals, and hence understands relationships between concepts, and hence is the one that is capable of studying the concept of all concepts, which is the first cause, okay, or the prima causa, the non-perishable substances, has to give the foundation of physics, okay, and hence a physicist, and that is a direct statement by Avicenna at the end of his metaphysics, okay. A physicist cannot do physics properly without the metaphysics. Averroes' answer is, no way, this is nonsense. A physicist can go to his lab and do his job without caring about either metaphysics or theology. Why? The reason that he gives here and in that part of the commentary, and it's fascinating, it goes for around 50 pages. He says that Alexander and Avicenna following him were obsessed with the idea of complete demonstration, al-Burhan al-Mutlaq in Arabic, or absolute demonstration. And you do not need absolute demonstration. And in all fairness to Aristotle, Aristotle touches on this matter. And the one who pointed it out very well, of course, in his commentary on the physics was Sir William David Ross. Okay, because that is a huge debate that continues for over a millennium. The idea that Aristotle is a man of deduction and demonstration, but there are many elements in Aristotle that shows that he was aware that in physics you have to start with induction. And Rushd, being a good Aristotelian and at the same time interested in that break from that in that modal interest in Arabic philosophy, says no. Okay, you do not do physics, you do not need metaphysics in order to do physics. Now, in what ways that related to that first slide is that, in other words, you do not need to understand the relationship between the necessary existent and the possible existent in order to understand, okay, in order to do physics, or to understand the nature of possibility and how they function actually in front of you. If you want to do that, you can try it in metaphysics and logic, but you don't have to bind physics with it. The physicist or the empirical scientists do not need to wait for directions from metaphysicians and logicians about what she or he may or may not do. Okay, this is only on the level of al-Burhan, okay, or of absolute demonstration. So when you want to understand on a purely abstract level, okay, the relationship between concepts and their modalities, and even when you start doing that on the level of metaphysics, you are going to start, which was developed brilliantly in post-classical Islamic theology, the generation right after these two guys. Okay, usually people put Al-Ghazālī as the end of classical Islamic philosophy, or the beginning of post-classical. There is disagreement about that. Okay, but some people put him as the beginning of post-classical. Some people say that he's the end of the classical. I mean, Ghazali as a key figure. But what is very interesting is that right after the time of Averroes, okay, and starting from the 13th century, the proliferation of modern metaphysics and logic starts mushrooming, particularly in the eastern part of the Islamic and Arabic world. Okay, you start having developments of the modal operators and muwajahat al-mantiqiyya, which are rendered by some as 17 and in other words as 24. Okay, so the work of Qazwini and then later commentators on him, on the Shamsiyya and so on. And what these guys do is that they try to do exactly what Averroes is trying to explain here, is that they are trying to take the actuality of the being of possibility to develop on its own, and to think about it in relationship to science and in connection with problems of laws of nature. Like, for instance, to give an example, the way nowadays modern metaphysicians think about the use of possibilia in understanding laws of nature. A law of nature is true and can be called true not because it is essential, because it talks about the essences and the logical relations derived from the definition of two particular concepts, or a number of concepts. Okay, but a law of nature is true because it applies on a range of possible conditions. Okay, and the bigger family of possible words, they didn't use the language of possible words, even though they were very close. And you can see there is a very interesting way in which they developed that metaphysical foundation of separating modality as an epistemic and logical condition of approaching being, okay, versus assuming that truth and being are one and the same. in terms of temporality. And as I said, there is a disagreement of understanding the modal system for those of you who are interested in contemporary analytical philosophy of Islamic philosophy. I, for one, I believe that they have elements between modal realism and in the work of someone like Lewis, okay, and a form of conceptual modality like that, which you find in Kripke. They have elements of both of them. But the field is still open for a lot of research to discuss. The most important thing, and in order not to take more time, because I'm already out of time, is to just wrap up my discussion with three things. I already talked about that. The first thing is that points, or the harmony between the two critiques, okay, of Al-Ghazālī and Averroes, in the sense that they share the same epistemic and the same interest in establishing logic and epistemic condition as a foundation for understanding being, shows a very interesting connection between the two guys. And if we connect it with later and earlier sources, we can find a systematic interest in modal thinking as a critique of naturalism, and hence also make a claim about whether or not, because that is an ongoing debate in Islamic among scholars of Islamic philosophy, were they just continuing Greek naturalism or followers of Greek naturalism, or were they doing something different? So I think that responds to many things. I already talked about the connections. For those, if you look at my handout, possible connections between Al-Ghazālī and Averroes' use of modality and conceptions of modality, their critique of essentialist metaphysics. I'm more than happy to talk about why I think Ghazali and Averroes are more in line with a Kantian rather than a Leibnizian position, which I think is Leibniz was more on the side of Avicenna, and he was a defender of Aristotle, but I leave that to the question and answer period. Last but not least, and this is an important, is that I think this critique and similar ones are very relevant to anyone in Arabic and Islamic studies, or anyone interested in the discursive and non-discursive history of Islam, because that is connected with many interests on social and political and civic levels, in having a pluralistic understanding of rationality and its manifestation in society, and modality makes that possible. Also, for I know many people in anthropology and Arabic and Islamic studies are interested in critiques of essentialism and structuralism. Well, it was not that those guys were relativists or postmodernists by any means, but they were interested in a middle form of foundationalism that is neither as strict and essentialist as that of the Aristotelian system, nor purely relativistic as some post-structuralist contemporary theories are, for instance. And this is what I love about contemporary modern position as well, and thinkers in the modern period like Kant. That's it. Okay, thank you so much. Okay.
Any questions from our audience? We should take a look at what's going on Zoom.
Sure. Yes, I think there are two chats. I
think Ron has a question.
Okay. Yes. So, can we stop the? I need to stop the share. Yes. Yes. Now I can see. Yes, Ron.
Okay. I love this talk, Ahmed. I'm very stimulated, and I have a lot to digest. You mentioned Descartes at one point.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have anything to say about his relation to what these guys are doing?
Well, that's, I mean, historically, there is a lot of talk about how he was obvious. I mean, there are obvious influences of Ghazali on him, and many of the examples that he uses in the first meditations. But the interesting thing is, I think, his interest in the question of certainty. How can I be certain? And hence the epistemic conditions as a foundation or as a new foundation for understanding or reshaping the questions of metaphysics, versus starting from the assumption, the Parmenidean assumption of being and truth as two obverse sides of the same thing, and then moving, which is precisely why Charles Kant says he needed something to shake that. He needed, and I think maybe his reading of Ghazali, if it is historically verifiable, and they say they found the copy of the Latin translation of the Deliverance from Error. So it's, I mean, that he was supposedly using, but I think that the most interesting part is the epistemic condition, the interest in certainty and doubt, which you definitely see in Ghazali. Ghazali talks about doubt systematically towards the end of his life, in particular, and I think Descartes was smart enough to take that interest and do with it what he did, and define the three modes of being based on the levels of certainty that I can have of them, which is the res cogitans, the res existentia, and God. So I think this is what, and that is what allowed for the whole break of modern philosophy. I see Kant. We share an interest. You are the Kantian. I mean, I see Kant as doing the exact thing. I mean, Kant is making an epistemic critique. I mean, this is what, for me, a very humble understanding of what Kant meant by critique. It's an epistemic critique of what and how we can use how we can conceive, metaphysics, and what metaphysics is all about as a science of rational cognition, as an architectonic of reason, as an architectonic of concepts. Thank you. Yes, okay, yes, Ahmed.
About the part where Averroes mentions the separation of physics and metaphysics, how can we relate this to modern physics? A lot of things in modern physics are actually more abstract and conceptual than being purely empirical, and many people actually consider it in the realms of metaphysics, like how string theory works in 12 dimensions and we aren't living in 12 dimensions, how all of the subatomic particles are actually basically non-existent, but we consider them to work. They're somehow metaphysical, but in a sense, they work in our physical world. So in this sense, we cannot separate both metaphysics and physics, because metaphysics is still in relation to physics.
Great question, and here is my answer. Okay? And I'm glad you brought it, because you should have brought it and hit me with it. So there is a difference between the metaphysical foundation of empirical science, which was what I said was happening later in the generation after, with modality, with the generation after Ghazali and Averroes, okay? And assuming a metaphysical framework within which physics operates. There is a distinction between both of them. So it's not that Averroes was saying, okay, that there is no use for metaphysics. He realizes very well that there are certain concepts that are fundamental for physics. Not everything is based on empirical research. But his point was that the idea that metaphysics itself, and this is why he was against it, this is the fundamental point, more than the dependence of physics and dependence of inductive physics over deductive metaphysics, is the claim that the idea or the claim of Avicenna that possibilia or possible concepts are necessitated when they come to being by the action of the necessary system, that would kill science. Because you are immediately assuming that by understanding the logical relationship between these concepts, that's it, and that's all. Put them in a syllogism, and as Avicenna would pray to God to give him the right middle term and write poetry praising the middle term, okay, al-habb al-awsat, in order to find the right, and that's it, and forget about any scientific research. So no, he is completely aware, and he and Ghazali, that there are metaphysical foundations for science, like the concept of causality, but they didn't fully articulate. Ghazali tried, for instance, with the concept of causality. Let's take one of them. Okay, but he left us in confusion. This is why you find Ghazalians who said that, like Yahya Michaud, for instance, who said that Ghazali is a demonstrative thinker, and others who say, no, 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 but look at his claims about causality. He is a Humean skeptic. So which one is right? And to me, the solution is understanding modality. The point is that these sophisticated systems of modal epistemology and metaphysics were still cooking in the classical period. They never got fully articulated by these guys, except in these few sections that we find here and there, where they have a clear opposition to the idealism or the idealistic tendencies of let us say, let me put it this way, devout Neoplatonists like Avicenna. Yes, I heard the sound. Thank you. Sharif, good to see you. Glad you made it.
Yeah, you hear me now?
Yes, I think I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Nice to see everyone. I have a quick question regarding like the difference between Ghazali and Averroes. Yeah, so I understand like Ghazali's position, like because like he's coming from this kind of dialectical approach that yes, you can be open more to the modal understanding of things, but now if you're somehow like relying on demonstrative approach, how can you, like in case of Averroes, how can you base your system on like some kind of modal premises, because you need some kind of definitions in order to be a demonstrative thinker. If you leave like a large logical space for like possibilities, you can't do demonstrations. So I was just wondering how Averroes would combine like his demonstrative approach with
his what approach? I'm sorry.
Like demonstrative approach.
Yes.
With having this modal outlook in general. I don't know. Did you hear me well, or you got my question?
I heard most of it, so I will try to. So I rephrase it first and tell me if I understood you right or wrong. You are saying if Ibn Rushd or Averroes is a demonstrative thinker, how could he still maintain an interest in modality? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because at some point you need to somehow have some kind of definitions, but then definitions, if they are like relying on some aspect of possibilities only or a large logical space like this, or I mean, like then you can't like define things. I mean, like you'll have like so many conclusions possible. I mean, which is So that's
okay. So there are two things here. Very good question and justifiably brought up. There is a huge range. This is one of my interests, actually. I have a paper, I'm finalizing its revisions now on Averroes and Avicenna, and I have another one. There is a whole plethora of critiques by Ibn Rushd of Avicenna, and that is the subject of scholarship for ages. I mean, it goes back to the medieval period, like the debates between Duns Scotus and Aquinas, I mean, and so on. So within that framework, you find many interesting critiques of the modal perspectives of Avicenna, okay, without necessarily, and please underline this part, without necessarily Ibn Rushd interweaving it with his in a full way with his theory of demonstration that we get in the grand commentary on Kitab al-Tahlilat al-Ula, the prior analytics and posterior analytics. Okay, so you are right to be concerned about that, but there are many that I cannot go through in the current. There are many ways in which he has tendencies in his system of demonstration to accommodate for his interest in modality. However, to answer the first part of your question, there is no problem in modality being a foundation for fundamentality. I mean, this is how Lewis and all our Lewisian friends and Kripkean friends, what they are doing. I mean, and nowadays there are many countries who are doing it as well. So having a fundamental commitment to modality as a foundation for demonstration is not in and of itself a problematic position, if I understood you correctly. So, but you are absolutely right. You need to have a system of logic to support that, and a system of metaphysics to support that. And this is what was happening in that later period, as I mentioned. I mean, but in Ibn Rushd, it was still cooking. But from my humble perspective, his recipe was far more rigorous than that of Ghazali. But at least Ghazali saw the points because he was a far better seasoned, as I said, more seasoned philosopher. Ghazali.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I think we will perhaps wrap things up
Okay,
there.
thank you so
But,
much.
I suppose if anybody left over has a question, they can
Yes.
in fact, yes. I think I'll ask it.
Okay, sure.
So my question is really simple. It's more about like the Abyssinian system. So Avicenna uses the structure of God and then the mind and then the will soul.
Which is a Neoplatonic. Yes.
Yes, I know. But then he calls like the first cause necessary being. So, but like the Neoplatonic system was built on the idea of beyond
Yes.
existence. So how does that validate the Abyssinian system?
Well, that's precisely how he was trying to break it. I mean, he thought of these. He inherited these modal interests, which comes from creation. I mean, the reason why he says necessary system versus possible is that, unlike the Greeks, he didn't assume that being is just there and truth is expressed in it. He had the possibility that there could be nothing, which later on Leibniz picks up and he says the most fundamental question of metaphysics is why is there anything at all rather than nothing? That question was not possible in the mind of Parmenides of Plato. Being was just there. We are using our reason to discover the truth manifested. But, okay, he tried, you are absolutely right, to use that to sort of tailor it, as if you are bringing a piece of cloth and you have an already set model and you are trying to tailor it on that Greek structure. So instead of using the language of ecstasis of Neoplatonism, he calls it the necessary system. And this is why there were, as I tried to point out at the beginning, relapses in his use of modality, which Al-Ghazālī and Averroes tried to respond to. I hope I answered it.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.